This is the story of Johnny Lewis, a name once synonymous with rising stardom, now forever linked to a tragic and perplexing crime. On that fateful day in 2012, a seemingly ordinary morning in Los Angeles turned into a nightmare. The discovery of a brutally murdered woman and the subsequent death of her tenant, Johnny Lewis, sent shockwaves through the entertainment industry and beyond. But this isn't just a tale of a tragic end to a promising career. It's a mystery shrouded in darkness. What drove a once bright young man to commit such a heinous act? Was it a momentary lapse of judgment or a symptom of a deeper mental illness? We will try to find all the answers to these questions. Let's get started. On October 29, 1983, Johnny Lewis was born in Los Angeles, California. In his family, he was the middle of 3 siblings. Johnny began performing at the age of 5 at a small performing arts school. When Johnny Lewis won his first acting role, he was just 7 years old. Following that, Johnny appeared in a number of commercials, one of which was for Pizza Hut. He gained popularity in the late 90s and early 2000s by making appearances on popular TV sitcoms, including Malcolm in the Middle, Seventh Heaven, and Drake and Josh. When Johnny was 18 years old in 2001, he had earned enough money from acting to move out of his parents' North Los Angeles home and into a new house in Hollywood with a number of other rising stars. By the time Johnny turned 23 in 2006, he was in high demand. More major TV parts have come his way, including a recurring role in the 2000s hit sitcom The O.C. In 2006, he also dated pop sensation Katy Perry. Though their relationship was short-lived, it appears to have been passionate because Katy went on to write 2 songs about Johnny's rise to stardom. This occurred in 2008, 2 years later, when he was cast in the highly regarded motorcycle drama, Sons of Anarchy, as Half-Sack. Even though the program had made him incredibly wealthy and well-known, Johnny was becoming worried about the course it was heading. It was getting too violent, he thought. Johnny enjoyed studying philosophy, reading poetry, playing chess, staying up late, and drinking tea. It wasn't him who enjoyed playing violent situations on stage. He was a highly liked character and had a very successful season. "You have to cut me out of the screenplay," he told the writers. "I'm done with this for now." His character was canceled in 2009, despite the author's best efforts to persuade him to change his mind. They were shocked. Johnny made the decision to give up on serious acting roles after leaving Sons of Anarchy in order to devote more of his time to writing his first novel, which was about a musical genius trying to make his way in the world. To that end, he began asking around to see if anyone he knew of a quiet place where he could live and write. The writer lived just outside of Hollywood, in a gorgeous 6-bedroom home that was for rent. It has developed into a kind of safe haven for aspiring actors and actresses waiting for their big break throughout the years. Kathy Davis, the owner, is credited with helping it establish this reputation. She was a lovely woman who genuinely understood the difficulties faced by everyone who lodged at her home when attempting to make a name for themselves in Hollywood. She would take care of them, fix them meals, give rides, stay up late to hear about their annoyances, and lend them a sympathetic ear if they didn't get their way. Many of her tenants, many of whom went on to become well-known Hollywood stars, would subsequently credit their success to the restorative and calming time they spent at the villa with Kathy. Though Johnny's big break had already come from the Sons of Anarchy, he still liked the thought of living in a town so tranquil that appeared to welcome quirky creative types like himself. When Johnny called Kathy in April 2009, she confirmed he could stay in the Red Suite on the 2nd floor without a doubt. Once they were settled in, Johnny would tell his pals that the writer's villa was every bit as spectacular as he had imagined it would be. And Kathy in particular was every bit as great as everyone had described. In fact, he became acquainted with her nearly right away. Before learning a few months later that his fiancée Diane was expecting a child, Johnny's life appeared to be going really well. However, this completely derailed his intentions for writing his novel. The couple decided that Johnny would help take care of their child by moving in with Diane, who lived nearby, since he was quite thrilled about being a father. Unfortunately, Johnny and Diane's love for one another waned fast after becoming parents, and Johnny had moved out and back in with his parents. 9 months later, on April 6, 2010, Diane gave birth to a healthy little girl called Calumet. Soon after, Johnny and Diane got involved in a very nasty custody dispute for Calumet, which Johnny finally lost. Johnny decided to take his motorcycle out and just go ride around and clear his thoughts a few months later, in October of 2011, while he was still living with his parents. He went for about 2 hours to the west of La Out into the desert, where he lost control of his bike and crashed. His injuries were found to be somewhat mild until he arrived at the hospital. However, they were worried he might have suffered a head injury. Nevertheless, physicians sent him home after determining he had not had a concussion. However, he was not the same person when he returned home from the hospital. Michael, Johnny's father, noticed his son's behavior shift right away. He just started behaving strangely and erratically. He was constantly irritated, and his thoughts were not always comprehensible. Something was obviously wrong, and Michael couldn't help but think, maybe my son actually did have head damage from that motorbike accident, and the doctors just didn't see it. Michael arranged for Johnny to attend 2 different meetings, but Johnny declined to go. This time in December of that year, while he was enrolled in an acting class, Johnny's acquaintances began to notice something peculiar about him. All the students realized that he had a British accent as he began speaking. A few weeks later, on January 3, 2012, Johnny walks out the door. He then continues down the street, and, as he is maybe 10 or 15 feet away from his parents' house, he hears what sounds like someone screaming in distress. Thinking that the noise is coming from the apartment next door, he breaks into the place, only to find it completely empty. Wondering what's going on, Johnny then takes a nearby glass bottle and charges at the 2 men who own the apartment, hitting them both over the head with it. Johnny was arrested for trespassing, burglary, and assault with a lethal weapon when the police refused to believe his claims that he was defending himself. It was at last possible for Johnny's father to visit jail and release his son. Because of his inconsistent headbanging, attempted balcony jumps, and generally unruly behavior, officials moved Johnny from the general population to a mental health ward over the course of 8 days. After Johnny was released from his file, a jail physician stated that he thought Johnny had been hit in the brain at some point, which was why he was acting erratically and had obvious suicidal thoughts. Upon returning to his parents' house, Johnny was in complete physical disarray. His face was puffed up following his altercation with the 2 men in the apartment, and he had 2 black eyes. He was so emotionally upset that he wouldn't allow any members of his family to get close to him. He simply barricaded himself in his room and ordered everyone to leave. In addition, he had a strong sensitivity to light, to the point where he would switch off every light in his parents' house. He would grow angry and turn them all off again when they finally put them back on. He would finally turn off the fuse box belonging to his parents. Over the next few weeks after being released from jail, he appeared to be getting better, despite his apparent problems. About a month after he was released from prison at the end of January, his parents gave him permission to move out and live independently in Santa Monica, California, which is about 30 minutes away. But as soon as he moved out on his own, his problems came back. About a week after moving into this Santa Monica apartment on February 10th, he was arrested for striking an unidentified individual in the head outside of a yogurt shop. However, he was eventually freed on $20,000 bail. A few days later, Johnny strolled into the ocean while fully clothed. The hospital treated his hypothermia after he was rescued. Authorities detained him again for trying to break into a woman's Santa Monica residence a few days after he was discharged from the hospital. He claimed he thought it was his friend's flat, but nobody bought it, so he was arrested and later freed on bond. Johnny's parents eventually persuaded him to visit a doctor regarding the possible head injury they believed he sustained in the 2011 motorcycle crash after the second arrest in Santa Monica. The jailhouse staff had indicated that Johnny might have suffered a brain injury, but they hadn't given him a formal diagnosis. Before starting therapy, Johnny required a second opinion from a medical professional. But when Johnny finally saw a doctor, the diagnosis was schizophrenia, or bipolar disease, rather than a brain injury. After giving Johnny a prescription for medicine to treat both conditions, he was on his way. Johnny's illness worsened because he refused to take the medication and see a different doctor. For the break-in and assault on those 2 men in the apartment adjacent to his parents' house, Johnny was still facing a lengthy prison sentence. Instead of sending Johnny to jail, his attorney was trying to work out a compromise where he would spend a year in a mental health treatment center. But Johnny fired his attorney and represented himself in court because he was so sure that the charges would be dropped and he could go back to his life and live the way he wanted. Nevertheless, the accusations persisted, and he received a 1-year prison sentence. But when his father did show up to fetch him up on Friday, September 21st, 2012, the authorities had shortened Johnny's sentence to just 6 weeks because of prison overcrowding. Johnny was at an all-time low, despite having only spent 6 weeks in jail as opposed to the full year he should have been there. It was obvious that the duration had seriously harmed him. Johnny questioned his father in the car on the way home from prison. The writer's villa was the last place Johnny was when his life was still in order, and it was probably the last place he was happy, so he probably has a lot of fond memories attached to that place, and so that's a great place for him to go. Michael called Kathy Davis as soon as they arrived home to give her the rundown on the issue. It would be possible if you called Kathy Davis at the writer's villa and just asked if there's any way I can move back in. After spending the weekend with his folks, Johnny packed up his belongings and returned to the villa on Monday, September 24th. A couple of days afterward, the writer's neighbor, Dan Blackburn, who was 70 years old, was staring at the man on the road from his front window. He wore no shirt, just jeans and red sneakers. He was running around the road in a frenzy, and he was quite sweaty. He was just kind of peeking out from behind his curtain, observing this guy, whom he had never seen before, to see what would come next. The gentleman kept walking in an odd manner down the road for about 15 minutes, before turning and heading straight for Dan's place. He approaches the front step directly and begins tapping on the door. Although Dan was clearly a little worried, he pulled the curtain. He approached the door. He cast a sidelong glance at the throng and saw a man with big, brilliant blue eyes staring at Dan as though he could see right through them, but he couldn't. Dan bent down, opened the door a little, and peeked out. The man outside gave him a quick glance before coming in. John was, as it would prove out, Johnny Lewis. Johnny turned around and left before the two men could have a meaningful talk. Dan, utterly bewildered by this peculiar exchange, observed as Johnny merely strolled back towards the road, went inside the villa, and disappeared. After around half an hour, Dan is at his house alone when he hears his wife yelling for him to come outside. Dan quickly exits the house through the front door. As he pulls into his driveway, which separates his land from the writer's villa, he notices his wife standing there, looking up toward the back of their home in horror. He glances down and back, toward their rear deck. Dan and his wife had hired the man to paint their back deck that day, and Johnny Lewis is standing on top of him. Johnny is launching himself into the air. The worker is sitting there, attempting to defend himself, while he is also being hit by a piece of wood. Dan automatically goes to Johnny since he is covered in blood. Johnny hasn't seen Dan as of yet. Dan approaches him immediately, snatches his shoulder, and tries to take Johnny off. Even though he is yelling at Johnny to stop, Johnny doesn't seem to be fazed. After Dan pulls on Johnny hard enough, Johnny finally gets up, turns around, and levels Dan in the face since he's just ruining this worker. When Dan looks up after he falls to the ground, Johnny is simply standing over him and staring at him expressionlessly. It seems as though he was unsure of his next move with Dan. Dan was determined not to spend any more time, but he just stood there, staring at him. He leaped forward and struck Johnny square in the side of the head, but the man did not feel anything. He just stared at him, nonplussed, until Dan reached over his head and virtually snapped off a nearby lawn chair. But Johnny was unfazed by the whole thing. At this time, the man was barely able to stand, so Dan just grabbed him and fled back down the driveway. The worker just remained there, expressionless, staring at Dan. Takes his wife, and they run to the house, where the three of them succeed in entering. However, just as they are about to close the door, Johnny runs up and jumps right in front of them, jamming his arm in the gap between the door and the wall, preventing the door from closing because it is stuck on his arm. Johnny's arm is being pressed against the enormous wooden door by Dan, his wife, and the painter, who are all locked inside. They are all putting all of their weight on the door. Johnny, in the meantime, is trying to hold on to them. At last, the trio begins lifting the door and forcefully slamming it into Johnny's arm. Johnny took a few heavy hits before pulling his arm back, allowing them to close and lock the door. By this time, the painter and Dan's wife had hurried through the home, locking and shuttering every door. Dan, in the meantime, went to the side window that faced the writer's villa property, took out his phone, and dialed 911 while he was scanning the door for Johnny. After telling 911 what was happening and hanging up, Johnny materialized out of nowhere, sprinting down his driveway as though he were heading back towards the back deck. However, he stops almost exactly in front of Dan's window, turns, and starts running towards the villa property. After leaping over a fence, he reaches a massive wooden fence that encircles the entire villa property, standing at 99 feet. With ease, he just jumps, grips the top, and launches himself over the barrier, disappearing inside the home in a matter of minutes. Then Johnny turned around, and Dan followed him off of his land, around his property, and back into the villa. After entering the villa, Johnny ascended to the second story and entered Kathy Davis's room, where she was seated. Kathy probably turned and saw Johnny standing in the doorway. He was obviously insane, sweating a lot, and didn't appear to be wearing a shirt. Most likely she wasn't afraid. Johnny choked, kicked, and beat her. In his bedroom, he discovered a rusty hammer, which he used to repeatedly stamp on her skull or strike her over the head when she collapsed, completely defenseless. Whatever way he did it, Johnny broke her skull pretty good, and that's what killed her. After Kathy passed away, Johnny went after and killed her cherished cat. In the same manner, after Johnny had fled the villa, he saw Dan's house painter sitting outside. Dan approached the man and started beating him up, and this attack, like the one on Kathy and her cat, seemed to have no apparent reason. Dan, his wife, and the painter went back inside the house after he came out and drove Johnny away. After standing outside for a short while, Johnny ran down Dan's road, jumped over the two gates right in front of him, and eventually disappeared inside the villa. After entering the villa, Johnny is thought to have ascended to the top patio or the roof, from which he either leaped to his death or plummeted to the driveway below. His death was declared an accident by officials, not a suicide. Everyone believed Johnny had to be high on drugs when word leaked out about what had occurred at the writer's villa. However, upon receiving his toxicology testing, it was revealed that he had zero drug residue in his system, both legal and illicit. When he performed this heinous crime, he was totally sober. Some people think that Johnny's violent outbursts were caused by untreated head injuries he sustained in the motorcycle accident. Some disagree, claiming there was no connection between it and the head damage. It's evident that Johnny suffered from a few untreated mental illnesses, but it was one of these illnesses that caused the violence. Johnny Lewis's case highlights the critical impact of mental health issues and substance abuse on an individual's life. His erratic behavior and legal troubles were likely exacerbated by untreated mental health conditions and drug use. Despite his fame, Lewis appeared to lack a strong support system. The entertainment industry often places significant pressure on individuals, and without adequate support, managing personal struggles becomes more challenging. The death of Johnny Lewis underscores the potential for violence and tragedy when mental health issues are left unaddressed. This case serves as a reminder of the importance of early intervention and comprehensive support for those struggling with mental health and substance abuse. The case received significant media attention, focusing on Lewis's relationship with Katy Perry and his subsequent downfall.